A teacher calls the police on two black twin girls, assuming the worst when she sees them painting in the school hallway after hours. But when their mother shows up the next day, everything changes. Because she's not just any mom, she's the teacher's boss. What happens next turns the entire school upside down, exposing hidden prejudice, buried secrets, and a past this teacher never saw coming. Why were the twins really there that night? And what happens when the teacher is forced to face the truth in front of the very girls she tried to silence? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the art classroom, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Zora and Zaya Carter sat side by side at their usual spot in the back row, their sketchbooks spread open before them. The scratch of pencils against paper filled the quiet room as students worked on their various projects. Zora's hand moved deliberately across her page, each stroke careful and measured. She was adding detail to a portrait of Jean-Michel Basquiat, his distinctive crown symbol floating above his head. Next to her, Zaya worked on a flowing design that would connect their proposed portraits, her colored pencils bringing warmth to the sketch. "What if we put Nina Simone here?" Zaya whispered, pointing to a blank space on her sister's paper. Her music was like paintings in sound. Zora nodded, her eyes never leaving her work. And Maya Angelou could go on this side. Their faces could emerge from these patterns I'm drawing. Ms. Hemmings moved between the desks, her heels clicking against the floor as she observed the students' work. She paused at Emma Thompson's desk in the front row, bending down to examine the girl's sketch of a sunset. "Beautiful use of perspective, Emma," Ms. Hemmings said, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "The way you've captured the light is quite sophisticated." The teacher continued her rounds, passing by the twins' desk with barely a glance. Zora's shoulders tensed slightly, but she kept working, adding more detail to her sketch. Zaya gave her sister's arm a gentle squeeze under the table. When the final bell rang, the twins carefully packed their supplies and headed to the library. Mr. Wallace was already waiting for them at a corner table, his kind face lighting up as they approached. "There are my favorite artists," he said warmly, pulling out chairs for them. "Show me what you've got." Zora spread their sketches across the table while Zaya explained their vision. "We want to show how these artists broke barriers," she said. "See how the patterns flow between them? It's like their influence rippling through time." Mr. Wallace leaned forward, studying the detailed drawings. His fingers traced the intricate patterns that connected the portraits. "This is powerful work," he said softly. "The way you've integrated these cultural elements, the Adinkra symbols here, the jazz motifs there, it tells a story beyond just the faces." "We wanted it to feel alive," Zora said quietly, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about their work. "Like these artists are still speaking to us." "They are speaking," Mr. Wallace agreed. "And through this mural, you'll help others hear them too." He sat back, folding his hands. "I'll make sure the Arts Council understands the significance of what you're proposing. This is exactly the kind of statement Diversity Week needs." Later that evening, the twins sat at their kitchen island, working on homework, while their mother, Dr. Moore, prepared dinner. The kitchen smelled of roasting vegetables and herbs, and the familiar sounds of cooking created a cozy atmosphere. "Don't forget about the Diversity Week dinner next Friday," Dr. Moore reminded them, stirring something on the stove. "As superintendent, I need to give a speech, but I want you both there too." "We'll be there, Mom," Zaya assured her. "Maybe by then we'll have good news about the mural." Dr. Moore turned to look at them, her expression softening. "I've seen how hard you're working on that proposal. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you both for putting yourselves out there." Zora looked up from her textbook. "Did you ever feel scared when you were trying to change things from the inside?" Their mother was quiet for a moment, considering. "Every day," she finally said. "But being scared doesn't mean you're not ready. It means you understand what's at stake." The next morning, Zora was checking her email during study hall when she suddenly grabbed her sister's arm. Zaya leaned over to look at the screen, and both girls held their breath as they read, "Dear Zora and Zaya Carter, The Student Arts Council is pleased to inform you that your mural design has been selected for the Diversity Week installation. Your concept demonstrates exceptional artistic merit and aligns perfectly with our celebration of diverse voices in our school community. The mural will be featured on the main hallway wall and unveiled during the Diversity Week closing ceremony. Please meet with Mr. Wallace to discuss the next steps and materials needed. Congratulations. Zaya let out a quiet squeal and hugged her sister. Zora's hands trembled slightly as she forwarded the email to their mother, then hit print to keep a copy. "We did it," Zora whispered, a rare smile spreading across her face. "They actually chose our design." The twins hurried to the printer down the hall, their footsteps light with excitement. As Zaya retrieved the paper, Zora carefully tucked it into her backpack. Tangible proof of their success. Neither girl noticed Ms. Hemmings standing at the far end of the corridor, watching them with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. The approval email felt like a key unlocking something inside Zora. For the first time since they'd started working on the proposal, she allowed herself to imagine their art taking up space on the school's walls. Bold, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. "Ready to make some history?" Zaya asked, linking her arm through her sister's as they headed to their next class. Zora nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "Ready?" The Wednesday afternoon sun slanted through the school's west-facing windows, casting long shadows across the hallway where Zora and Zaya Carter set up their painting supplies. Mr. Wallace helped them arrange drop cloths along the base of the wall, carefully taping the edges to protect the floor. "Remember to work in layers," Mr. Wallace advised, opening a fresh can of primer. "Build your foundation first, then add the details, just like we discussed." Zora nodded, already mentally mapping out their first steps. She pulled her curly hair back into a tight bun while Zaya arranged their brushes by size. The blank wall stretched before them like an empty canvas full of possibility. "We'll start with the base colors," Zaya said, mixing paint in a tray. "Get the background tones right before adding the figures." They worked steadily, their movements synchronized from years of creating art together. Zora focused on laying down even strokes of deep blues and purples, while Zaya blended warm earth tones into the spaces between. The wall slowly transformed under their careful attention. Teachers passed by occasionally, some pausing to watch their progress. Mrs. Chen from the English department stopped to admire their work, noting how the colors seemed to flow like music across the wall. The school librarian, Mr. Rodriguez, gave them a thumbs up as he walked past. "Looking good, ladies," he called out. "Can't wait to see it finished." Mr. Wallace stayed nearby, grading papers while keeping an eye on their progress. He occasionally offered gentle suggestions about technique or color balance, but mostly let them work according to their vision. Around 4 o'clock, Ms. Hemmings walked by, her heels echoing in the nearly empty hallway. She slowed as she approached the mural, her expression carefully neutral. The twins continued painting, though Zora's brush strokes became slightly more deliberate under the art teacher's gaze. Ms. Hemmings gave a brief nod in their direction, then continued walking without comment. Mr. Wallace watched her go, his expression thoughtful, before turning back to the twins with an encouraging smile. "Don't mind her," he said quietly. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Your work speaks for itself." They painted until early evening, making significant progress on the background and beginning to sketch out the main figures in light pencil. Mr. Wallace helped them clean up and store their supplies in a locked cabinet he'd arranged for them in the art room. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked as they packed their bags. "Definitely," Zaya replied, studying their work with satisfaction. "We want to start on Basquiat's portrait tomorrow." The next day during lunch, Zora sat alone at a table in the cafeteria, waiting for Zaya to return from the bathroom. She absently sketched ideas for the mural's details in her notebook while eating her sandwich. Voices from the table behind her gradually filtered into her consciousness. "I just don't get it," someone was saying. "Our design was way more polished." "I know," replied another voice, Cleo Adams, who Zora recognized from art class. "Ms. Hemmings even said their design was too busy. She told me it lacked polish compared to some of the other submissions." Zora's pencil stopped moving. She sat very still, trying not to make it obvious she was listening. Like, I get that they're trying to be inclusive or whatever, Cleo continued. But shouldn't the best art win? Ms. Hemmings said our composition was more balanced. The words settled like stones in Zora's stomach. She carefully packed up her things and left the cafeteria, looking for her sister. She found Zaya already in the art room, preparing their supplies for the afternoon's work. "Hey," Zaya said brightly, then noticed her sister's expression. "What's wrong?" Zora told her what she'd overheard, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Ms. Hemmings has been talking about our design to other students, saying it's messy, unpolished." Zaya's hands stilled for a moment as she absorbed this information. Then she continued organizing their brushes, her movements precise and determined. "Of course she did," Zaya said finally. "But look at what we're creating. Our art tells stories she can't even see." She held up a sketch of their Basquiat design. "Let's make this silhouette so powerful it speaks for itself." That afternoon they worked with renewed focus. Zaya carefully built up layers of color in Basquiat's portrait, while Zora refined the patterns flowing around and through the figure. The design was bold, complex, and intentionally challenging, exactly as they'd planned it. By Friday morning, the mural had taken impressive shape. The background patterns were complete, and Basquiat's figure emerged from the wall like a vision, his crown symbol gleaming in metallic paint. The spaces where Nina Simone and Maya Angelou would be were carefully outlined, ready for color. Mr. Wallace met them before first period to check their progress and discuss the day's plans. He looked apologetic as he explained, "I have to attend a district meeting this afternoon, but I've arranged for you to stay and work. Here's written permission to use the art room and supplies." He handed them an official letter, then continued, "You can finish outlining the remaining figures, but remember to clean everything thoroughly when you're done. Lock the supply cabinet and slide the key under my office door." "We will," Zora assured him, carefully tucking the permission slip into her folder. "Don't worry, Mr. Wallace," Zaya added, "we've got this." During their free period, they packed their bags with everything they'd need for the afternoon. Healthy snacks, water bottles, their portable speaker for music, and extra clothes that could get paint on them. The mural was nearly halfway complete, each element flowing into the next exactly as they'd envisioned. Looking at their work, Zora felt a surge of pride. The design wasn't just beautiful. It was a statement, a celebration, a challenge to see art and artists through a different lens. Whatever Ms. Hemmings or others might say about it, the mural was unmistakably theirs, and it was exactly what they'd meant it to be. "Ready for this afternoon?" Zaya asked, bumping her shoulder against her sister's as they headed to class. Zora looked back at the wall one more time, at the faces emerging from their patterns, at the stories they were bringing to life in color and light. "Ready," she said, and meant it. The Friday evening sun slanted through the school's windows, casting long shadows across the empty hallways. Only the soft sounds of music and occasional laughter broke the after-hours silence as Zora and Zaya Carter worked on their mural. Maya Angelou's figure was taking shape beneath their careful brushstrokes, her robes flowing across the wall in shades of deep purple and gold. "Pass me the smaller brush?" Zora asked, not taking her eyes off the delicate detail work she was adding to Maya's collar. Zaya handed it over, then stepped back to study their progress. "The way her robes move into the background pattern is perfect," she said, nodding with satisfaction. Paint stained her fingers in rainbow hues, and a smudge of blue decorated her cheek. Their portable speaker played quietly in the background, just loud enough for them to hear but not echo through the empty building. The permission note from Mr. Wallace was taped carefully to the wall beside their supply cart, its official letterhead visible under the fluorescent lights. Zora hummed along to the music as she worked, feeling peaceful in the quiet space. These were her favorite moments, just her and Zaya, creating together, their vision coming alive beneath their hands. The stress of the past few days, the whispered comments and sideways looks seemed to fade away when they were working. "Look at how the light catches the metallic paint in her earrings," Zaya said, pointing to a detail she'd just finished. She wiped her hands on her paint-stained apron and reached for her water bottle. The twins shared a smile, their matching dark eyes bright with pride. The mural was everything they'd hoped it would be. bold, beautiful, and impossible to ignore. Maya Angelou's knowing gaze seemed to watch over the hallway, her presence both challenging and welcoming. Neither girl noticed Ms. Hemmings entering the building through a side door, her clicking heels muffled by distance. The art teacher had returned to retrieve her forgotten planner, not expecting to find anyone in the building so late. When she heard voices and music echoing faintly through the halls, she paused. Following the sound, Ms. Hemmings rounded a corner and spotted two figures in the dim hallway, working on the wall. From her distance, she couldn't make out their faces clearly in the uneven lighting. She saw only dark shapes moving against the wall, paintbrushes in hand, music playing from an unknown source. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she backed away quietly. Without moving closer to investigate or check for any authorization, she retreated to the main office. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report vandalism in progress," she said in a clipped tone. "There are unknown individuals defacing school property at Marshall High School. They're in the main hallway near the front entrance." The response was quick. Within minutes, police sirens could be heard approaching the school. The twins looked up from their work, confused by the sound but not yet alarmed. "Are there sports practices today?" Zaya wondered, setting down her brush. Before Zora could answer, the school's front doors burst open. Two police officers entered, flashlights beam cutting through the dimness. The harsh light swept across the wall and landed on the girls, who squinted and raised their hands to shield their eyes. "Don't move!" one officer commanded, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Step away from the wall!" Fear froze Zora in place, her paintbrush clattering to the floor. Zaya instinctively moved closer to her sister, her heart pounding. "Wait," Zaya said, her voice shaking slightly. "We have permission to be here. Look." She pointed to the note on the wall, but the officer cut her off. "Hands where we can see them," he ordered. "Move away from the wall now." The twins slowly raised their hands, paint still wet on their fingers. Zora found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "We're students. We're working on the Diversity Week mural. Our IDs are in our backpacks." "Against the wall," the second officer instructed, moving forward with handcuffs ready. "We'll sort this out down at the station." The sound of other voices began to filter in from the entrance. Students leaving late basketball practice had noticed the police cars and were gathering at the doors, phones raised to record what was happening. "But we didn't do anything wrong," Zaya protested as cold metal closed around her wrists. She could feel tears building in her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Please, just check our IDs." The officers proceeded with their protocol, patting down both girls and reciting their rights. Zora remained silent, her body rigid with shock and fear. She could hear whispers and gasps from the growing crowd at the entrance, could see the glow of phone screens recording everything. The twins were led toward the entrance, past their stunned classmates. Someone called out, "That's Zora and Zaya Carter." Another voice added, "They're supposed to be here." "They're painting the school mural." But the officers continued their procedure, guiding the girls outside toward the waiting patrol car. As they passed through the doors, the automatic hallway lights began their evening shutdown, clicking off in sequence. The last light went out just as the patrol car doors closed, leaving the unfinished mural in partial darkness. Maya Angelou's knowing eyes watched from the wall, half illuminated by the fading evening light through the windows as the car pulled away from the curb. Behind them, students continued recording with their phones, their voices rising in confusion and protest. The metallic paint in Maya's earrings caught the last ray of sunlight, glinting like a star in the growing darkness of the empty hallway. Hours later, the streetlights cast intermittent shadows across their faces as Lena Moore drove her daughters home from the police station. In the rearview mirror, she could see Zora and Zaya huddled together in the back seat, their shoulders touching, seeking comfort in each other's presence. Paint still stained their hands, evidence of their interrupted work on the mural they'd been so proud of just hours before. The dried specks of blue and gold caught the passing lights, reminders of creativity cut short by ignorance and suspicion. The car's interior remained silent except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. Zaya shifted in her seat, her voice breaking through the quiet like a whisper. "Mom, I'm so sorry." "Not your fault." Lena cut in firmly but gently, her eyes meeting Zaya's in the mirror. Her jaw remained clenched, but her tone carried warmth meant to comfort her daughters. "None of this was your fault." She gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening as she fought to keep her own anger contained. Zora hadn't spoken since they'd left the station. She stared out the window, her reflection showing eyes that seemed focused on something far beyond the passing scenery. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. The street signs and storefronts blurred past, meaningless against the weight of what had happened. When they pulled into their driveway, Lena turned off the engine but didn't immediately move to get out. She took a deep breath, turned in her seat, and looked at her daughters directly. The overhead light illuminated their faces, young, beautiful, and carrying an expression no child should have to wear. The shadows under their eyes spoke of innocence shattered too soon. "Let's get inside," she said softly. "You both need rest." She reached back and squeezed Zaya's knee, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The house felt different tonight, too quiet, too still. The twins moved through their nighttime routine mechanically, brushing teeth and changing into pajamas without their usual chatter. Lena watched them from the hallway, her heart aching at how small they looked, how the evening had stripped away their usual confidence. The home that had always been their sanctuary now seemed unable to shield them from the outside world's harsh realities. Once the girls were in bed, Lena tucked them in like she used to when they were younger. She smoothed Zaya's hair back from her forehead, squeezed Zora's hand gently. "Try to sleep," she murmured. "We'll figure everything out tomorrow." She lingered a moment longer, watching their faces in the soft glow of the nightlight, memorizing the innocence that someone had tried to tarnish. In her study, Lena switched on her desk lamp and spread out the incident report. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined every detail, every checkbox, every signature line. The more she read, the deeper her frown became. The paper crinkled beneath her fingertips as her grip tightened with each new revelation. No guardian contact attempted, no verification of student status requested, no principal notification or signature. Just a teacher's report of suspicious activity and immediate police response. The procedural failures piled up like kindling, feeding the controlled fury building in her chest. Every overlooked protocol represented another moment her daughters had stood frightened and alone. Lena reached for her tablet, pulling up her district superintendent's schedule. Monday's school visit was already highlighted. A routine check-in now transformed into something far more urgent. Her finger hovered over the calendar entry, then moved to Saturday instead. This couldn't wait until Monday. The system that had failed her daughters would not have the luxury of a weekend's reprieve. She spent the next hour reviewing school policies, district guidelines, and student rights documentation. Her notepad filled with precise observations and pointed questions. The lamp's soft glow cast shadows across her face as she worked, determination settling into every line of her expression. She circled key passages with red ink, building her case with the methodical precision that had earned her reputation. When she finally went to bed, sleep proved elusive. She lay awake, thinking of her daughters' faces in the back seat of her car, of the unfinished mural waiting in a dark hallway, of all the other children who might face similar situations without having a superintendent for a mother. The ceiling above her bed became a canvas for her racing thoughts and quiet resolve. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows. Lena dressed with particular care, selecting a perfectly pressed charcoal blazer and matching slacks. She deliberately chose to skip makeup and jewelry. This morning called for nothing but her natural authority and unwavering purpose. Her reflection showed a woman armed with truth and righteous indignation. She checked on the twins before leaving. They were still asleep, Zaya's arm thrown protectively across Zora's shoulder, their faces peaceful in rest. Lena closed their door quietly, leaving a note on the kitchen counter explaining where she'd gone. She added, "I love you both" at the bottom, underlined twice. The school parking lot was empty except for the janitor's truck when she arrived. Her car's tires crunched on the salt-covered asphalt as she pulled into her usual spot. Through the windshield, She could see the janitor unlocking the main entrance, right on schedule. The building looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Lena gathered her leather portfolio and stepped out of her car. The morning air was sharp with cold, but she barely noticed it. Her heels struck the pavement in a steady rhythm as she walked toward the entrance, each step purposeful and measured. Her breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the winter air. The janitor held the door for her with a respectful nod, recognizing the district superintendent. Inside, the hallway stretched out before her, still dim with early morning shadows. To her right, she could see the twins' unfinished mural. Maya Angelou's knowing gaze seemed to follow her as she passed. The poet's half-completed words about caged birds and freedom stood as silent witnesses to yesterday's injustice. Her footsteps echoed through the empty corridors like a metronome, marking time as she made her way toward the administrative wing. The sound bounced off lockers and bare walls, announcing her approach with unwavering regularity. Teachers' posters about respect and inclusion lined the walls, their messages now ringing hollow. The principal's office door stood closed, its frosted glass window dark. Lena Moore stood before it, straight-backed and resolute. She raised her hand and knocked once, hard. The sound cracked through the morning silence like a judge's gavel. Behind that door lay the first step toward accountability, and she was prepared for whatever battle awaited. The school secretary, Mrs. Bennett, looked up with surprise as Lena Moore's commanding presence filled the front office. Her morning routine of sorting mail and checking messages halted mid-motion, a stack of unopened envelopes frozen in her hands. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim slightly, as if acknowledging the superintendent's authority. "Dr. Moore," she stammered, rising quickly from her desk, smoothing her cardigan nervously. "We weren't expecting you until Monday." "Good morning, Mrs. Bennett," Lena replied evenly, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable purpose. "Is Mr. Michaels in?" "Yes, he just arrived. Let me—" Mrs. Bennett hurried to the principal's door, knocking softly before poking her head in. "Mr. Michaels, Dr. Moore is here to see you." Through the open door, Lena could see Principal Darren Michaels hastily adjusting his tie and smoothing down his rumpled shirt. He'd clearly settled in for a quiet Saturday of catching up on paperwork, his coffee still steaming on his desk beside a half-eaten bagel and scattered budget reports. "Dr. Moore," he called out, standing to greet her, pushing his reading glasses up onto his forehead. "Please come in. What brings you by on a Saturday?" Lena entered the office, noting how Mr. Michaels' welcoming smile didn't quite reach his eyes. A practiced administrator's mask she recognized all too well. She took the seat across from his desk, setting her leather portfolio precisely in front of her with deliberate care. "Thank you for seeing me without notice," she began, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality she'd perfected over years of administrative work, a tone that revealed nothing while demanding everything. "I need to review the incident report from last night regarding the students who were detained." Mr. Michaels' smile faltered slightly, a twitch at the corner betraying his discomfort. "Oh, that. Yes. Well, it was handled by campus security and Ms. Hemmings. Standard procedure for vandalism suspects, you understand? Nothing to worry about." "The full report, please," Lena requested, extending her hand, palm up, fingers steady. He hesitated, then turned to his filing cabinet, the metal drawer squeaking as he pulled it open. "Of course. Though it's still being processed." He rifled through a drawer, pulling out a thin manila folder. "Here we are." Lena accepted the folder and opened it carefully, her manicured nails clicking softly against the paper. Her eyes moved methodically across the page, taking in every detail, every checkbox, every hastily scribbled note. When she reached the names, her fingers tightened imperceptibly on the paper's edge. Zora Carter. Zaya Carter. The office fell silent except for the soft whir of the heating system and the distant sounds of a janitor's cart rolling down the hallway. Mr. Michaels shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Lena continued reading, her expression growing more focused with each passing moment, the slight furrow between her brows deepening. Finally, she looked up. When she spoke, her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. "Mr. Michaels, I have several questions about this incident." He nodded, reaching for his coffee cup like a shield, fingers wrapping around the ceramic as if seeking comfort. First, Lena continued, why was no guardian contacted when 2 minors were detained on school property? Well, the officers took charge of the situation. It happened rather quickly. Second, she pressed on, not allowing him to finish his weak explanation. Why did no internal staff member verify the mural's approval status before law enforcement was called? Ms. Hemmings reported unauthorized individuals. We were following protocol. And third, Lena's voice dropped even lower, a quiet intensity that filled the room. Why were these students suspended without any investigation into the circumstances? Mr. Michaels set his coffee down, some of it sloshing onto his desk calendar, staining the upcoming week with brown droplets. Dr. Moore, I understand your concern, but we followed standard security protocols. When suspicious activity is reported— I need 3 things, Lena interrupted, her tone brooking no argument, each word measured and precise. The security footage from last night, the permission email from Mr. Wallace authorizing the students to work on their approved mural project, and Ms. Hemmings's written statement regarding the incident. The security footage might take some time to— Now please. Mr. Michaels's chair squeaked as he stood, the sound painfully loud in the tense silence. I'll have Mrs. Bennett help gather those materials. 10 minutes of tense silence passed as the requested items were collected. Lena reviewed each document methodically, making occasional notes in her portfolio, her pen moving with quiet purpose. Mr. Michaels watched nervously from behind his desk, his coffee now cold and forgotten, occasionally dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. When she had everything in order, Lena closed her portfolio and stood, the leather binding making a soft snap that made Mr. Michaels flinch. I'll be back Monday morning, she stated. Have all staff involved in this incident present for a meeting at 8 a.m. sharp. Mr. Michaels nodded quickly, relief evident on his face as she turned to leave, his shoulders sagging visibly. But at the door, Lena paused and looked back, her gaze piercing. One more thing, Mr. Michaels. Those suspicious individuals you failed to identify? They're my daughters. She left him sitting there, mouth slightly open, color draining from his face, and walked purposefully down the main hallway, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. Her steps slowed as she approached the mural, still unfinished in the morning light filtering through nearby windows. The figures of Jean-Michel Basquiat and Maya Angelou emerged from a swirling background of vibrant colors and African patterns, their eyes seeming to follow her. Nina Simone's powerful profile was just beginning to take shape at the edge, a promise of strength not yet fully realized. Lena stood before it, taking in every detail. The careful brush strokes, the bold color choices, the way the composition drew the eye naturally across the wall, telling a story of heritage and resilience. She could see Zora's distinctive style in the symbolic elements, the hidden meanings tucked into shadows, Zaya's characteristic attention to detail in the patterns, each line placed with intention and care. They did this, she whispered, her voice carrying equal measures of pride and determination. The words hung in the empty hallway, a quiet acknowledgement of both her daughter's talent and the fight that lay ahead, a mother's promise that would not be broken. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the living room windows when Lena returned home. The house was quiet, too quiet for a Saturday. She found Zora and Zaya in the living room, both curled up on opposite ends of the brown leather couch. Their sketchbooks lay unopened on their laps, more like shields than the creative outlets they usually were. When Lena entered, they looked up with matching expressions of uncertainty, their eyes following her movement. Lena set her portfolio down on the coffee table with deliberate care. She noticed how Zaya's fingers twitched toward her sketchbook's cover but never opened it, how Zora seemed to sink deeper into the couch cushions. The silence felt heavy, loaded with unspoken words. Let's have an early dinner, Lena suggested, her voice gentle but firm. I picked up that pasta you both like from Giovanni's. In the kitchen, Lena moved with practiced efficiency, warming the food and setting the table while the twins helped with smaller tasks, Zaya getting drinks, Zora placing napkins. Their usual dinner preparation dance felt stilted, mechanical, Once seated, Zaya made a visible effort to break through the tension. "The garlic bread smells good," she offered, her voice slightly too bright. "And they remembered the extra cheese this time." Zora remained silent, pushing her pasta around the plate with her fork. The scraping sound seemed to echo in the kitchen. Lena took a slow sip of water, then set her glass down carefully. "I need you both to tell me exactly what happened yesterday," she said. "Everything, from the moment Ms. Hemmings saw you until the police arrived. Don't leave anything out." The twins exchanged glances across the table. Zaya straightened in her chair, while Zora's shoulders tensed. "We were just painting," Zaya began, her voice steady at first. "The hallway was pretty empty because it was late, but we had Mr. Wallace's note right there on the wall. We even had our school IDs out on top of our supply cart." "The music wasn't even loud," Zora added quietly, her first words since Lena had come home. "We could hear our own footsteps." "Then we saw the flashlights," Zaya continued. "Two officers came around the corner really fast. They didn't even ask us anything at first. Just told us to step away from the wall and put our hands where they could see them." Zora's fork clattered against her plate. "We tried to explain. I pointed at the note, but they wouldn't let us get close enough to show them. One of them grabbed my arm when I tried to reach for our IDs," Zaya said, her voice catching. "And then people started coming out from basketball practice. Everyone was watching, taking videos. The officer said I was resisting." Zora's words came out barely above a whisper. "When I didn't stand up fast enough. He pulled the handcuffs tighter. It hurt." Tears began rolling down Zaya's cheeks. "We could hear people whispering. Someone laughed, and Ms. Hemmings was just standing there by the office door, watching. She didn't say anything, didn't try to help." Lena reached across the table and grabbed Zaya's hand, squeezing it firmly. "I believe you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of both comfort and conviction. "I believe every word." Zaya squeezed back, but Zora pulled her hands into her lap, staring down at her barely touched dinner. They finished eating in relative silence, the twins picking at their food while Lena watched them carefully, noting every flinch, every unspoken word in their body language. After dinner, while Zaya helped clear the table, Zora slipped away to her room. The sound of her door closing was followed by quiet movements, the rustle of paper, the soft thud of things being removed from walls. In her bedroom, Zora stood on tiptoes, carefully taking down each piece of artwork that had decorated her walls. The self-portrait she'd done last summer, the series of abstract paintings that had won her honorable mention in the district art show, the charcoal studies of her family. She removed them all, her movements mechanical and precise. She opened her bottom drawer and began placing the artwork inside, face down. Each piece disappeared under the next, like she was burying them. The walls, once vibrant with her creativity, stood bare and accusatory in the fading daylight. Meanwhile, in her home office, Lena sat at her desk, documents spread out before her. Her yellow highlighter moved purposefully across the pages as she noted discrepancies in the school's account of events. The timestamp on the security footage didn't match the time listed in Ms. Hemmings's statement. The official incident report failed to mention Mr. Wallace's written permission. She circled each inconsistency with sharp, precise strokes. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Mr. Wallace's name appeared on the screen. "I just heard. Let me know how I can help." Sunday morning light filtered through Ms. Hemmings's kitchen window, casting a deceptively warm glow across her granite countertops. She sat at her breakfast nook, a half-empty coffee cup growing cold beside her as she stared at the district's follow-up request. The official letterhead seemed to glare back at her, the words, "Special Hearing, Tuesday, 9 a.m., standing out in bold type. Her hands, usually steady from years of demonstrating brush techniques, shook slightly as she reached for the copy of her submitted statement. The paper was crisp, the words typed in Times New Roman, professional and detached. Observed 2 unidentified individuals engaging in unsanctioned painting activity. Potential vandalism. No staff supervision present. She remembered typing those words late Friday night after returning home from the school. They had seemed so clear then, so justified. Now, in the harsh morning light, each word felt heavy with implications she hadn't considered. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Ms. Hemmings took another sip of her coffee, grimacing at its coldness. She read the statement again, her eyes catching on unidentified individuals. Had she really not recognized them? Zora and Zaya Carter had been in her class since September. She saw them 3 times a week, watched them work, graded their assignments. Unsanctioned painting activity. The phrase made her stomach twist uncomfortably. She'd used those exact words to describe actual vandalism last spring when someone had spray-painted obscenities on the gym wall. But this had been different, hadn't it? The girls had been using proper art supplies, working on what was clearly a structured piece. Standing abruptly, Ms. Hemmings walked down the hallway to her home office. The room was meticulously organized, with color-coded files and neatly labeled shelves. Several student portfolios were stacked on her desk, waiting to be reviewed for the upcoming district art show. Zora's portfolio sat right on top, its black cover unmarked except for her name in neat silver letters. Ms. Hemmings's fingers hesitated before opening it. The first page was a full-color self-portrait, Zora's face emerging from a background of intricate patterns. The technique was flawless, the emotion raw and powerful. She flipped through more pages. Urban scenes captured in bold strokes, cultural motifs woven through everyday objects, studies of hands in various positions, some reaching, some creating, some in prayer. Her own handwritten notes appeared throughout the portfolio, red ink precise and encouraging. Excellent composition. Strong narrative elements. Creative use of perspective. On the most recent piece, dated just 3 days ago, she had written, "Beautiful use of negative space, powerful lines." Ms. Hemmings sank into her office chair, the portfolio open in her lap. The contrast between her written praise and her actions on Friday night felt like a physical weight on her chest. She thought about the moment she'd seen the figures in the hallway, how quickly she'd reached for her phone. Had she even tried to look closer? To recognize the students she saw 3 times every week? A sharp ping from her laptop cut through her thoughts. A new email notification appeared in the corner of her screen. Her throat tightened as she read the sender's name. Dr. Lena Moore, Superintendent. The message was brief but clear. Mandatory full staff review meeting, Monday morning, 8 a.m. sharp. All relevant parties to attend. Supporting documentation required. Ms. Hemmings's hands began to tremble again as she read the final line of the email. Preparedness and transparency are expected. No assumptions. No excuses. Dr. Lena Moore. The signature line seemed to pulse on the screen. Dr. Moore's reputation for addressing systemic issues head-on was well known throughout the district. She didn't call meetings to smooth things over or maintain the status quo. Ms. Hemmings closed her laptop with shaking fingers. She stood and walked to the full-length mirror hanging on her office wall, a vintage piece she'd bought at an antique store when she'd first started teaching. The woman who stared back at her looked smaller somehow, less certain than the image she was used to seeing. For the first time in her 20-year teaching career, Ms. Hemmings looked at herself and felt doubt creep in around the edges of her carefully constructed professional persona. Was she the victim of a misunderstanding as she'd first thought? Or was she the source of the problem? Her reflection offered no answers, just the image of a woman who had always prided herself on being fair and professional, now wondering if those very words meant something different than she'd always believed. The Monday morning sun cast long shadows through the library windows as staff members filed in for the unexpected faculty meeting. The usual morning chatter was noticeably absent, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press against the bookshelves. Teachers exchanged uncertain glances, their coffee cups clutched like shields against whatever was coming. Ms. Hemmings chose a seat near the back, her posture rigid and her face carefully composed. She'd spent hours preparing her explanation, rehearsing words that now felt hollow in her mind. Her portfolio sat unopened on her lap, a physical reminder of all the evidence she'd gathered to defend herself. At the front of the room, Principal Michaels shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his tie slightly askew despite obvious attempts to straighten it. The fluorescent lights highlighted the sweat beginning to form on his forehead. He cleared his throat twice, but before he could speak, the library doors opened. Dr. Lena Moore entered the room with measured steps, her heels clicking against the floor in a steady rhythm. She carried a single manila folder, unmarked except for a small red tab. Her face was calm, but there was steel in her eyes that made several staff members look away. She didn't take her place at the podium. Instead, she stood directly in front of the gathered faculty, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Good morning," she finally said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room without effort. "I'm sure you're all wondering why you're here instead of preparing for your first classes." She placed the folder on the table beside her, each movement deliberate. On Friday evening, 2 of our students were handcuffed and detained by police while working on an approved school project. Today, we're going to watch exactly what happened. She nodded to Mr. Wallace, who dimmed the lights and started the projector. The security footage began to play on the large screen behind her. The timestamp showed 6:45 p.m. on Friday evening. The grainy video revealed Zora and Zaya Carter working on their mural, their movements careful and coordinated. The sound was faint, but clear enough to catch their occasional laughter, the soft music playing from their speaker. They worked with obvious purpose, referring to what appeared to be detailed sketches spread out on the floor beside them. Several teachers leaned forward, watching as the girls stepped back occasionally to check their progress, discussing color choices and shading techniques. The artistic intention was unmistakable. This wasn't vandalism, it was creation. Dr. Moore let the footage play until 7:15 p.m., when the first flash of police lights appeared on the video. She raised her hand and Mr. Wallace paused the recording. "Now," she said, picking up the folder, "I'd like to share some documentation." She pulled out a printed email and held it up. "This is the official mural approval, signed by Mr. Wallace and the Arts Council, dated 2 weeks ago. It includes the complete design proposal, timeline, and designated wall space." She placed it on the table, then extracted another paper. "And this is the report filed by Ms. Hemmings on Friday night." The room grew even quieter as Dr. Moore began to read. "Observed 2 unidentified individuals engaging in unsanctioned painting activity, potential vandalism, no staff supervision present." She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Ms. Hemmings. 2 unidentified individuals. Ms. Hemmings felt the weight of every eye in the room turn toward her. Her carefully prepared explanations crumbled in her mind as Dr. Moore continued. "Zora and Zaya Carter have been students here for 2 years, Dr. Moore said, each word precise and measured. "They've maintained honor roll status every semester. They've participated in multiple art shows, won district competitions, and contributed to every school cultural event." She paused, letting the facts settle. "Ms. Hemmings has taught them both. She's graded their work, written their recommendations, and seen them 3 times a week since September." The discomfort in the room was palpable. Several teachers shifted in their seats, others stared at their hands. Mr. Michaels had stopped trying to look professional and was simply standing there deflated. "What happened Friday night wasn't a mistake," Dr. Moore continued, her voice taking on an edge that made everyone sit straighter. "It was a misjudgment steeped in a pattern of invisibility, a pattern where certain students, despite their achievements, despite their presence, despite their humanity, remain unseen." Ms. Hemmings raised her hand slightly, her voice wavering as she began. "Dr. Moore, I can explain." "You didn't forget them," Dr. Moore cut in, her words sharp enough to make Ms. Hemmings flinch. "You just didn't see them." The morning bell rang, its familiar chime jarring in the tense atmosphere. Not a single person moved. The sound echoed through the library and faded, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Dr. Moore picked up the folder and placed it deliberately in the center of the table. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her heels marking each step with finality. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but her words remained, hanging in the air like an indictment none of them could escape. Sometime later, the afternoon sun filtered through the Venetian blinds in Dr. Moore's district office, casting striped shadows across her desk. The building had settled into that peculiar quiet that comes after lunch, when most administrators were caught up in meetings or site visits. She sat in her leather chair, allowing herself a moment to breathe after the intensity of the morning's faculty meeting. Her hand moved to the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she kept locked. The key turned with a soft click, and she withdrew a thick manila folder labeled Racial Incident Reports Unresolved in her precise handwriting. The folder was heavier than she remembered, filled with documents she'd flagged during her initial review of district practices after accepting the superintendent position. Dr. Moore spread the contents across her desk methodically, creating neat piles by school and date. Her fingers lingered on the reports from the twins' school, pulling them into a separate stack. She hadn't had time to address these properly during her transition period, but now they demanded her full attention. The first report caught her eye immediately. A Muslim student, Amira Hassan, had been sent to the office for wearing a hoodie during Ramadan. The write-up described her as suspicious and unwilling to comply with dress code. Dr. Moore's jaw tightened as she read the additional notes. Student became defensive when questioned about attire. The referring teacher's signature was familiar, Ms. Hemmings. She reached for her reading glasses, pulling another file closer. This one detailed an incident with Marcus Thompson, a black sophomore who had challenged a grade on his English essay. The report characterized his tone as aggressive and confrontational during what should have been a routine academic appeal. The documentation noted that he was placed on behavioral probation for disrespecting authority. Again, Ms. Hemmings's name appeared in the witness statements. Dr. Moore's hand trembled slightly as she opened the next file. This one she remembered clearly. It had crossed her desk just 2 months ago. Zaya's self-portrait, submitted for the Winter Art Showcase. The piece had received the highest peer review scores in the class, but had been rejected from the final exhibition for being too intense and not aligned with the show's aesthetic goals. The evaluation form bore Ms. Hemmings' signature, along with her recommendation that Zaya consider more traditional approaches. As she read through each report, patterns emerged in the language used. Words like aggressive, intense, unreasonable, and difficult appeared repeatedly when describing students of color. White students with similar behaviors were labeled passionate, creative, or advocating for themselves. The bias wasn't always obvious, but it was consistent. Dr. Moore picked up her phone and began making calls. Her voice remained steady and professional as she reached out to the students mentioned in the reports. "Hello, this is Dr. Moore, the district superintendent. I'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about your experiences at school. Your perspective would be valuable to me." Some calls went to voicemail. Others connected immediately. Each student she spoke with agreed to meet, their voices carrying a mix of surprise and cautious hope that someone was finally asking to hear their stories. By late afternoon, her calendar had 3 appointments scheduled for that evening. She ordered dinner to be delivered to her office. This would be a long night, but a necessary one. The first meeting began at 6 p.m. Amira Hassan, now a freshman in college, sat across from Dr. Moore's desk, her hands folded in her lap. She spoke softly but clearly about her experiences, describing how the hoodie incident had made her feel targeted and unwelcome. "After that, I stopped wearing any religious clothing to school. I just wanted to disappear." At 7 p.m., Marcus Thompson arrived. Now a senior, he carried himself with careful control, as if constantly aware of how others might perceive him. He described the grade appeal incident in detail, explaining how his legitimate academic concerns had been dismissed and reframed as behavioral issues. "I learned to just accept the grades I was given," he said. "Speaking up wasn't worth the trouble." The final meeting of the evening was with Sarah Chen, a current senior and member of the Asian Student Alliance. She shared stories of subtle dismissals and microaggressions that had become so common, students rarely reported them anymore. "We joke about it," she said, "but it's not really funny. It's just easier than fighting every time someone makes assumptions about us." Dr. Moore took detailed notes during each conversation, but she hardly needed to. The pattern was clear, and it matched exactly what the reports had suggested. This wasn't about isolated incidents or individual misunderstandings. The problem was systemic, woven into the very fabric of how the school operated. As she sat alone in her office after the meetings, Dr. Moore looked at the mural approval form still sitting on her desk. What had happened to Zora and Zaya wasn't just about one teacher's mistake or one mishandled situation. It was about an entire system that allowed certain students to be seen as threats rather than talents, problems rather than possibilities. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing. This wasn't about the mural anymore. That incident was just the crack that had finally made the deeper issues visible. This was about dismantling a system that had been failing students of color for years, hiding behind policies and procedures that looked neutral on paper, but played out with devastating inequality in practice. The morning sun crept through Zora's window, painting thin stripes of light across her ceiling. She lay still in her bed, watching dust motes dance in the golden beams, her body heavy with a weariness that sleep couldn't touch. Her sketchbook sat untouched on her desk, its familiar leather cover now seeming somehow foreign and accusatory. The gentle tap at her door made her flinch, but she didn't answer. Zaya's voice filtered through, soft but insistent. "Zora? We promised Mr. Wallace we'd meet him at Riverside Cafe before school, remember?" Zora closed her eyes, trying to summon the energy to respond. The thought of facing anyone, even Mr. Wallace, made her stomach clench. But Zaya's persistent knocking continued, and finally, Zora managed a quiet, "Coming." She dressed mechanically, pulling on a worn sweater and jeans without really seeing them. Her reflection in the mirror looked wrong somehow, like someone had taken her usual self and slightly blurred the edges. She grabbed her backpack, deliberately avoiding looking at the art supplies that usually filled its front pocket. The drive to the cafe was quiet. Zaya attempted small talk, mentioning something about their history homework, but her words seemed to evaporate in the heavy air between them. Zora stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by without really seeing them. Riverside Cafe sat on a corner, its large windows streaming with morning light. Mr. Wallace was already there, seated at a table near the back, 3 steaming cups waiting. He stood as they approached, his face gentle with concern. "Good morning, ladies," he said, pulling out chairs for them both. His voice carried its usual warmth, but Zora could hear the careful note of worry underneath. She slid into her seat without meeting his eyes. Zaya took a sip of her hot chocolate. Mr. Wallace had remembered their usual orders and started talking about their weekend, carefully avoiding mention of Friday night. She described the movies they'd watched, the pancakes their mom had made on Sunday, the new song she'd been practicing on guitar. Her voice filled the space between them like a shield, protecting Zora from having to speak. Mr. Wallace listened patiently, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. His eyes occasionally drifted to Zora, noting her untouched drink, her hunched shoulders, the way her fingers twisted in her sleeves. Finally, during a natural pause in Zaya's monologue, he spoke. "Your mural is already saying more than most people ever do." His voice was soft but firm. "But it's not finished. Don't let them take your voice." Zora's head lifted slightly, and for the first time that morning, she made eye contact. Her words came out barely above a whisper, rough with disuse. "They already did." The pain in her voice made Zaya reach for her hand under the table, but Zora pulled away, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. The rest of breakfast passed in a blur of gentle encouragement from Mr. Wallace and Zaya's determined attempts at normalcy. Zora remained silent, occasionally nodding but mostly staring into her cooling cup of tea. When they arrived at school, the hallway felt different. Students moved through it as always, but there was a new tension in the air, a sense of something altered. Then they saw it. The mural, their mural, surrounded by yellow caution tape. The tape formed a perfect rectangle around their work, transforming their art into something that looked dangerous, forbidden. The mural itself was untouched. Maya Angelou's half-finished face still gazed out with dignity. Basquiat's crown still gleamed with fresh paint. But the caution tape made it look like a crime scene. Signs posted at either end read, "Project temporarily suspended. Do not cross." Students passed by, some slowing to stare, others whispering behind their hands. A few faces wore smirks, as if vindicated by the tape's presence. Ms. Peterson, who usually greeted them warmly, hurried past without making eye contact, her heels clicking rapidly against the linoleum. Zora walked past her own artwork as if it belonged to someone else. Her eyes slid over the figures she and Zaya had spent hours perfecting, the colors they had mixed just right, the patterns they had practiced again and again. It all looked foreign now, tainted by Friday night's events. The day dragged on in a fog of silence. In English, when called on, Zora simply shook her head. In history, she handed in a blank worksheet. At lunch, she sat with her food untouched, watching the clock tick through each minute with excruciating slowness. After the final bell, Zaya led them to the art room. The familiar space, usually a sanctuary, felt hollow now. Zaya pulled out her sketchbook and opened it to their original mural design. With determined strokes, she began adding new figures to the composition. More faces, more stories, more voices joining the chorus they had started. Zora sat across from her, watching her sister's pencil move across the page. The scratch of graphite on paper used to be her favorite sound. Now it felt like fingernails on a chalkboard. Her own hands lay useless in her lap, heavy as stones. The afternoon light shifted through the art room windows, casting long shadows across their table. Zaya continued working, her focus intense, as if she could draw enough strength into the design for both of them. But Zora felt something inside her stretching, pulling until she couldn't stay still any longer. Without a word, she stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor, making Zaya look up, but Zora was already moving. She walked out of the art room, her steps echoing in the empty hallway. As she passed the mural, she kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to look at the caution tape that transformed their vision into a warning. Her pace quickened as she approached the front doors. She pushed through them, stepping out into the afternoon sun, leaving behind the weight of unfinished art and unspoken words. The Wednesday morning sun cast long shadows through the district headquarters windows as people filed into the main conference room. The emergency school board hearing had drawn a crowd. Teachers clutched their notebooks, students whispered in clusters and through the glass doors, reporters jostled for position, their cameras ready. Inside, the room hummed with tension. 7 board members sat at an elevated table, their faces stern beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. Dr. Lena Moore stood at the center, her blazer crisp, her expression unreadable. To her left, a large screen waited dark and ready. Ms. Hemmings sat alone in a chair before them, her usually perfect posture slightly wilted. Her hands lay folded in her lap, but her fingers kept twisting together, betraying her nervousness. The room's sharp lighting seemed to catch every wrinkle in her blouse, every bead of sweat on her forehead. "This emergency session will now come to order," Dr. Moore announced, her voice carrying easily through the packed room. "We're here to address the events of Friday evening and examine the broader pattern they represent." She pressed a button and the screen flickered to life. Security footage played silently, Zora and Zaya painting, their movements careful and coordinated. The timestamp clearly showed early evening hours. "The students were working on an approved project," Dr. Moore continued, advancing through a series of slides. "Here is the official email confirmation. Here is Mr. Wallace's written permission. Here is the Arts Council's documentation." Each piece of evidence appeared methodically, building a clear timeline. Ms. Hemmings shifted in her chair as her own statement appeared on screen, its vague wording now seeming glaringly inadequate. "We'll now hear testimony from affected parties," Dr. Moore announced. The lights dimmed slightly as a video began playing. On screen, a student's silhouette appeared, their voice digitally altered but their words clear. "I wanted to explore abstract expressionism," the voice said. "But Ms. Hemmings told me my style wasn't sophisticated enough yet. She said I should stick to still lifes until I developed more refinement. Later, I saw white students getting encouraged to try abstract work in their first week." Mr. Wallace stepped forward next, his presence commanding respect. "Zora and Zaya Carter followed every protocol," he stated firmly. "They submitted designs, received approval, maintained a clean workspace, and documented their progress. Their artistic vision was clear, their execution skilled. They did everything right." A murmur rippled through the room as Cleo Adams, a white student from Ms. Hemmings's advanced class, approached the podium. She pulled out a folded paper with trembling hands. "I need to share something," Cleo began, her voice quiet but steady. "Last month, Ms. Hemmings was reviewing our portfolios. She stopped at my work and said, 'Some kids' art is more refined than others.'" When she said it, she looked directly at Zora's piece on the wall. The message was clear. Ms. Hemmings straightened in her chair, color rising to her cheeks. "I'd like to respond," she said, her voice strained but controlled. The board nodded. "I didn't recognize them in the dim light," she insisted, standing now. "I acted based on what I saw. 2 figures in a dark hallway painting on school property. I followed protocol for suspected vandalism." Dr. Moore's response cut through the room like a blade. "You didn't act on what you saw," she said, her tone measured but firm. "You acted on what you assumed." She advanced to the next slide, a compilation of incident reports all showing similar patterns of bias. "This isn't about one night," Dr. Moore continued. "This is about a pattern of assumptions, of different standards, of invisible barriers. This is about students being told in 1,000 small ways that their vision doesn't matter." The board members leaned forward, reviewing the evidence before them. The room fell silent as they deliberated, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Finally, the board president spoke. "We will now vote on the proposed disciplinary action." 7 hands raised in unanimous agreement. "Ms. Caroline Hemmings," the board president announced, "you are hereby suspended from your teaching position. Your license will be revoked for 1 year, during which time you must complete comprehensive racial bias training. Additionally, you will serve at the Equity Rehabilitation Program under Dr. Moore's direct oversight." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Ms. Hemmings sat very still, her face pale, as the reality of accountability settled over the room. Dr. Moore stood, gathering her materials. "This isn't about punishment," she said, addressing not just Ms. Hemmings, but everyone present. "This is about accountability, about learning to see clearly, about doing better." The gavel struck again, marking the end of the session. Justice had begun, not with vengeance, but with the first step toward change. The kitchen light cast a warm glow as Zora stepped through the front door. The house was unusually quiet. No music from Zaya's room, no TV buzz from the living room. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the gentle ticking of the wall clock marking time. Lena sat at the kitchen table, still in her work clothes but with her blazer draped over the chair behind her. Her usually pristine appearance showed signs of a long day. A few strands of hair had escaped her bun, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked up as Zora entered, offering a gentle smile. "Come sit with me," Lena said softly, gesturing to the chair across from her. It wasn't a command, but an invitation. Zora hesitated for a moment, then slid into the seat. Her backpack dropped heavily beside her, full of untouched art supplies she'd carried around all day like dead weight. The kitchen felt different in this light, more intimate, like a confessional space. They sat in silence for a while. Lena didn't push, didn't prod. She simply waited, her hands wrapped around a cooling mug of tea. The clock continued its steady count, marking the moments between them. "How was the hearing?" Zora finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It went as it needed to," Lena replied, her tone measured. "But that's not what we need to talk about right now." She reached across the table, her hand open, an invitation Zora could choose to accept or decline. Zora looked at her mother's outstretched hand, the same hand that had signed district policies, that had gathered evidence, that had fought for justice, the same hand that had tucked her in at night after the incident. Slowly, she placed her own hand in her mother's. "Talk to me," Lena said softly. "Not about what happened, about how you feel." Zora's throat tightened. She stared at their joined hands, at the contrast of their skin tones, at the way their fingers interlocked. Mother and daughter, bound by choice and love rather than blood. The words came slowly at first, like water breaking through a dam. "I keep thinking about their faces," she began, her voice trembling. "The officers, the students watching. Ms. Hemmings. They all looked at me the same way, like I was—" She paused, struggling to find the right words. Lena squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "It wasn't just the handcuffs," Zora finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's that they looked at me and saw nothing, not even a name." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pulled her hand back, wrapping her arms around herself. Lena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up, her chair scraping softly against the floor. Without a word, she walked out of the kitchen. Zora could hear her footsteps heading toward the master bedroom, then the sound of closet doors opening and closing. When Lena returned, she carried a large, worn portfolio case, its edges frayed and its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. She placed it carefully on the table between them. "I haven't opened this in years," she said, running her hand over the case's surface. "But I think it's time." She unzipped the portfolio with careful movements. Inside were dozens of paintings and sketches, vibrant pieces filled with bold colors and raw emotion. Each one spoke of pain, of joy, of struggle, of triumph. Zora leaned forward, drawn to the intensity of the work. "These are yours?" she asked, touching the corner of a particularly striking piece, a self-portrait rendered in fierce reds and deep blues. Lena nodded. "From high school. I was about your age when I painted most of these." She pulled out one specific piece, a dark, abstract composition that seemed to writhe with contained energy. "This one was my response to my art teacher telling me that black girls shouldn't paint pain, that we should stick to prettier subjects." Zora looked up sharply, recognition flickering in her eyes. "I stopped painting after that," Lena continued, her voice soft but firm. "For months, I didn't touch a brush. I thought if I couldn't paint what I felt, what was the point?" She paused, touching the canvas gently. "But then I realized, by not painting, I was letting them win. I was silencing myself." She looked directly at Zora now, her eyes intense with understanding. "I picked up the brush again, not because I had to prove anything to them, but because I had something to say. And now, so do you." Zora felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. She nodded slowly, unable to speak, but hearing every word her mother hadn't said. Later that night, in the privacy of her room, Zora sat at her desk. The drawer where she'd hidden her crumpled sketches seemed to call to her. With trembling hands, she pulled it open. The sketches were still there, crushed and creased from her anger and fear. She lifted them out carefully, one by one, spreading them across her desk. Each crumpled line felt like a surrender she wasn't willing to accept anymore. Slowly, methodically, she began to smooth them out. Her fingers traced each fold, each wrinkle, pressing them flat against the desktop. The papers held the memory of her pain, but also the shadow of her vision, the things she'd wanted to say before fear had silenced her. Her paint set sat untouched on the shelf, where it had remained since that Friday night. Zora stood and retrieved it, setting it beside the flattened sketches. The familiar weight of it in her hands felt both foreign and like coming home. She opened the set, the click of the latches loud in the quiet room. The paints were still there, waiting, rich browns, deep blues, vibrant yellows. Her brushes lay in their slots, clean and ready. With careful movements, she selected a brush. It felt different now, not just a tool, but a statement. She didn't reach for the mural designs or the school projects. Instead, she pulled out a fresh canvas, small but blank with possibility. In the silence of her room, Zora began to paint. No audience, no approval needed. Just her brush, her colors, and the truth she needed to tell. It wasn't about walls or permission anymore. It was about finding her voice again, one brush stroke at a time. Thursday morning arrived with an unsettling quiet at school. The hallways felt different, as if the very air had changed since the hearing. Students moved through their usual routines, but there was an undercurrent of tension that couldn't be ignored. Zora and Zaya walked to their first class together, their footsteps echoing in the unnaturally hushed corridor. Where there used to be casual greetings and friendly waves, Now there were averted gazes and sudden conversations that died as they passed. Some students practically pressed themselves against lockers to avoid crossing their path, while others offered awkward, mumbled, "sorry about what happened" comments that felt more like obligations than genuine sympathy. Zora kept her head down, her shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. Her sketchbook, once proudly displayed, was now buried deep in her backpack. Zaya walked beside her, head held high but eyes watchful, protective as always. In chemistry, their lab partner suddenly forgot their shared assignment. In English, the usual discussion group left 2 empty seats where the twins normally sat. Each small rejection added another layer to the invisible wall building around them. The morning dragged on, heavy with unspoken words and uncomfortable silences. Teachers seemed uncertain how to act. Some were overly cheerful, others strictly professional. The art room, with Ms. Hemmings's absence, felt like a tomb. The substitute teacher didn't even take attendance, just wrote "free period" on the board and sat at the desk, avoiding eye contact. When lunch finally arrived, the twins found their usual table empty, not surprisingly, since most of their regular lunch companions had been mysteriously busy all week. Zaya unpacked their lunches while Zora stared at her untouched sandwich, picking at the crust without actually eating. The cafeteria buzzed with the normal lunchtime chaos, but it felt distant, as if the twins were in their own bubble of silence. Students at nearby tables would glance their way, then quickly look down when caught, their whispers barely audible but present nonetheless. Then came the soft sound of approaching footsteps. Cleo Adams stood at their table, her presence unexpected and uncertain. Her hands fidgeted with something, a folded piece of paper that she held like it might break. The usual confidence that came with being one of Ms. Hemmings's favorites was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made her seem smaller. Without a word, Cleo placed the paper in front of Zora. Her hand trembled slightly as she set it down, and she quickly withdrew, turning and walking away before either twin could respond. Her quick exit drew curious stares from nearby tables, adding another layer to the already thick atmosphere. Zaya reached for the paper when Zora made no move to take it. The careful creases came apart under her fingers, revealing a short message written in neat, precise handwriting. "I'm sorry. I should have spoken sooner. If you'll let me, I want to help finish the mural." Zaya read the note twice, then looked at her sister. "She testified at the hearing," she said softly. "Mr. Wallace told me she came forward about what Ms. Hemmings said about your work." Zora continued staring at her sandwich, but her fingers had stopped their nervous movement. The paper sat between them like a bridge, or perhaps a wall, depending on how you looked at it. "Maybe we should let her help," Zaya suggested carefully. "It could be good, showing people we're still going to finish it." Zora remained silent, but her shoulders tensed slightly at the mention of the mural. She hadn't looked at it since that Friday night, avoiding that hallway entirely, taking longer routes between classes. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of uncomfortable moments and forced normalcy. When the final bell rang, Zaya gently tugged at her sister's sleeve, pointing toward the art hallway. Zora hesitated, but followed, each step seeming to require conscious effort. The yellow caution tape still stretched across the hallway entrance, creating a barrier between the regular school world and their unfinished work. The mural waited behind it, half-completed figures reaching out from the wall, their stories interrupted mid-sentence. Mr. Wallace stood there, keys in hand, his presence solid and reassuring. He didn't smile. He understood this moment didn't call for smiles, but his eyes held a steady warmth as he looked at them. "The district cleared you to finish," he said simply, holding up the keys, "but only if you want to." Zaya stepped forward immediately, her hand reaching for the keys, but she stopped, turning back to look at her sister. Zora stood frozen, staring at the caution tape as if it represented everything that had happened. The assumptions, the handcuffs, the silence. The hallway held its breath. Mr. Wallace waited patiently, the keys still extended. Zaya's hand remained outstretched, caught between taking the keys and waiting for her sister. Slowly, like ice beginning to thaw, Zora moved forward. Each step seemed to carry the weight of decision, of choice, of reclaiming something that had been taken. She passed under the caution tape, her movements deliberate and measured. The mural spread before them exactly as they'd left it that Friday night. Maya Angelou's flowing robes still reached toward completion, their careful brushstrokes a testament to the work that had been interrupted. The unfinished portion seemed to call out, waiting for their vision to be completed. Zora approached the wall slowly. Her hand lifted, trembling slightly, and pressed against the surface. The paint was long dry, but she could feel the texture of their work beneath her palm. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath as if drawing strength from the very wall itself. "I'm not done speaking," she whispered, her voice barely audible but firm with conviction. Without another word, she knelt beside their supply box, still sealed with evidence tape. Her movements became more certain as she began unpacking their brushes, laying them out in their familiar order. Each brush represented a choice to continue, to speak, to create, despite everything that had tried to silence them. Friday afternoon arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the school's windows, casting long shadows across the hallway where 3 girls worked steadily on the mural. Zora and Zaya moved with practiced precision, their brushstrokes confident and deliberate as they restored what had been left unfinished. Their friend Danny, a tall girl with box braids tied up in a colorful scarf, worked alongside them, carefully following their lead. The hallway smelled of fresh paint and creativity. Music played softly from Zaya's speaker, a mix of jazz and neo-soul that kept their rhythm steady. They had been working for almost an hour, bringing depth back to the faces that had waited so patiently for their return. Zora focused intensely on Nina Simone's eyes, mixing deeper browns and blacks to capture the fire that had always burned there. Her hand moved with purpose, each stroke precise and meaningful. She hadn't spoken much, but her art spoke volumes, the determination in her brushwork, the care in her blending. Zaya worked on expanding the background, incorporating new figures that emerged like ghosts from the wall. Dancers from the Alvin Ailey Company, writers whose words had changed worlds, artists whose names history had tried to forget. Her strokes were bold and sweeping, creating movement where there had been emptiness. Danny moved between them, helping with detail work and color mixing. She handled the supplies with reverence, understanding the weight of what they were creating. "These colors are singing together," she said softly, stepping back to admire how the deep purples melted into rich blues. The quiet focus of their work was interrupted by hesitant footsteps approaching from the main hallway. Cleo Adams stood at the edge of their workspace, clutching brushes and a small bag of paint supplies. Her presence created an immediate tension in the air, like a wrong note in a familiar song. Zaya looked up first, meeting Cleo's uncertain gaze. After a moment's consideration, she gave a small nod. Not quite welcome, but permission. Zora's brush paused mid-stroke, but she didn't turn around. Her shoulders tightened slightly, the only indication she'd noticed Cleo's arrival. Cleo moved carefully into the space, setting her supplies down without a word. She stood awkwardly for a moment, then picked up a brush and looked to Zaya for direction. Zaya pointed to a section of background that needed base coating, and Cleo went to work immediately, her movements careful and conscious. The afternoon continued in this way, Cleo following instructions, staying quiet, trying to be helpful without being intrusive. She mixed colors when asked, cleaned brushes without being told, and kept her distance from the main figures that Zora and Zaya were crafting. The silence wasn't exactly comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It felt like a necessary space between what had been and what could be. Danny occasionally tried to ease the tension with quiet comments about the artwork, but mostly everyone focused on their tasks. Hours passed this way, the mural growing more vibrant with each passing minute. New faces emerged from the wall, Catherine Dunham dancing, Elizabeth Catlett sculpting, Alma Thomas painting. Their stories wove together in sweeping lines and bold colors, a testament to voices that refused to be silenced. The accident happened during a color change. Cleo was carrying a fresh palette of yellow paint, stepping carefully around their supply boxes. Maybe it was nervousness, maybe just bad luck, but her foot caught on the edge of a drop cloth. The palette tilted, sending a stream of bright yellow paint directly onto Zora's shoes. Time seemed to freeze. Danny's brush stopped mid-stroke. Zaya's eyes widened. Cleo stood horrified, the empty palette shaking in her hands. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Cleo stammered, dropping to her knees with paper towels. "I'm so sorry. I can buy you new shoes. I'll replace them right away. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's fine." Zora's voice cut through Cleo's panic, quiet but firm. She didn't look down at her paint-splattered shoes or at Cleo's frantic cleaning attempts. She just kept painting, her brush moving steadily across Maya Angelou's face, adding highlights that made her smile seem to glow from within. Cleo's apologies trailed off into silence. She cleaned up the spill as best she could, then returned to her assigned section, her movements even more careful than before. The incident hung in the air for a few minutes, then gradually dissolved into the rhythm of their work. As the afternoon light began to fade, they stepped back to look at their progress. The mural had evolved beyond its original design. It felt deeper now, more honest. The figures seemed to hold both joy and defiance in their faces, a recognition of struggle wrapped in celebration. Zaya was the first to speak what they were all thinking. "It needs something else," she said, touching an empty space in the center. "Something about now. About us." Zora nodded slowly, already reaching for her sketchbook. Her fingers, stained with various colors, moved quickly across the page. Two figures took shape. Black girls on a ladder, their bodies stretched upward with purpose. In their hands, chains transformed into threads of gold, weaving through the other figures like strands of light. She held up the sketch without words. Zaya smiled. Danny nodded enthusiastically. Even Cleo, standing slightly apart, seemed to understand the power of the image. They worked until the evening janitor's keys could be heard jingling in the distance. As they packed up their supplies, Zora carefully photographed their progress, paying special attention to the space where the new centerpiece would go. That night in her room, Zora pulled out the journal she hadn't touched since the night of the arrest. Its pages had waited patiently for her return. She opened to a fresh page and wrote slowly, deliberately, "She's not forgiven, but she's trying. That counts for something." The next day they would begin the centerpiece, two black girls transforming chains into golden threads, their story rising from the very walls that had witnessed their silencing. It wasn't part of the original plan, but some truths demand to be told in their own time, in their own way. The Monday morning sun filtered through the school's windows, casting long shadows across the freshly painted mural that was now nearly complete. Word had spread quickly through text messages and social media that the controversial artwork was approaching its final stages. Throughout the day, students began taking detours between classes, some walking slowly past the hallway, while others clustered in small groups, phones raised to capture photos. The reactions varied as visibly as the mural's colors. Some students stood in genuine appreciation, pointing out details to their friends, the way Maya Angelou's words seemed to float off the wall, how Basquiat's crown tilted just so, the dancers whose movements appeared frozen mid-leap. A group of art students lingered longer than others, discussing technique and color choices with quiet admiration. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Several students walked past with exaggerated eye rolls, their dismissive glances speaking volumes. Others whispered behind raised hands, shooting furtive looks at the artwork before hurrying along to their next class. The hallway had become a stage where every reaction played out in full view. Zora stood at her usual spot, adding careful details to the golden threads that wound through the piece. She kept her focus on her work, trying to ignore the constant stream of observers, but her ears caught every comment, every whispered judgment. Zaya worked nearby, occasionally glancing at her sister with concern, noting how Zora's shoulders tensed with each new group that passed. The morning had been manageable until a cluster of boys walked by, their backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders. One of them, a tall student in a Letterman jacket, looked at the mural and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Guess it pays to cry racism." Zora's hand froze mid-stroke, paint dripping slowly from her brush. The words hit her like a physical force, making her fingers tighten around the wooden handle. For a moment, she stood completely still, the urge to turn around and confront him burning in her chest. The boy's footsteps continued down the hall, fading away with his friend's laughter. Instead of speaking, Zora dipped her brush in fresh paint. With deliberate movements, she began adding something new to the mural, an abstract face emerging from the background. She worked quickly but precisely, creating a figure that seemed both present and absent at once. The face took shape without eyes, surrounded by concentric lines that rippled outward like sound waves, or perhaps like blindness spreading. Zaya noticed the addition immediately. She moved closer to her sister, studying the strange new element with curiosity. "What does it mean?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Zora continued working, adding deeper shadows to the eyeless face. "The people who look but don't see," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. The face seemed to stare back at them, or rather failed to stare, its blank expression a mirror for those who passed by without understanding. Meanwhile, in the staff room, teachers gathered during their lunch break, cups of coffee growing cold as they discussed the recent events in hushed tones. The room had a tension to it, like a rubber band stretched almost to its breaking point. Small groups formed and reformed, conversations shifting as different staff members entered and left. "She should have been fired," one teacher said firmly, stirring her coffee with unnecessary force. "A suspension isn't enough. What message does that send?" Another teacher, grading papers at the corner table, looked up. "She got what she needed," she responded thoughtfully. "Sometimes learning is better than punishment. Isn't that what we're supposed to teach?" Mr. Wallace sat quietly at his desk, apparently focused on his laptop, but his ears caught every word. His fingers moved across the keyboard, typing a brief but detailed note to Dr. Moore about the ongoing conversations among staff. He understood the importance of documenting these reactions, knowing they revealed as much about the school's culture as the incident itself had. The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor to the mural. After the final bell had rung and the hallways had emptied of students, Ms. Hemmings walked slowly toward the artwork she had once mistaken for vandalism. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as she approached, her face carefully neutral. She stood before the mural, taking in its full scope for the first time. Her eyes moved methodically across the surface, noting the technical skill in the execution, the careful attention to detail, the sophisticated use of color and composition. She lingered on each face, each figure, reading the story they told together. When her gaze reached the centerpiece, the two black girls on the ladder, transforming chains into threads of gold, she stopped. Something flickered across her face, too quick to name. The metaphor was clear, impossible to misinterpret. The chains of assumption, prejudice, and fear becoming something else entirely in the girl's hands, something bright and powerful and free. Ms. Hemmings didn't smile as she studied this central image. Her expression remained carefully composed, professional even in solitude. But after a long moment, she gave a single deliberate nod, an acknowledgement of something understood if not yet fully processed. Then she turned around and walked away, her footsteps fading down the empty hallway, leaving the mural to speak its truth in silence. The Friday morning of Diversity Week arrived with an electric anticipation that hummed through the school's hallways. Students and staff gathered in the main corridor, their conversations creating a low murmur that bounced off the walls. The space felt smaller with so many bodies pressed together, all eyes focused on the large cloth that concealed the finished mural. Though reporters and camera crews had requested access to the unveiling, they remained outside the building's doors. This was Zora's one request, that this moment belonged to the school community alone. No outside eyes, no media spin, just the pure, unfiltered reaction of those who would walk past this artwork every day. Dr. Moore stood at the front of the assembled crowd, her presence commanding even in silence. Her dark blazer and simple gold necklace reflected her usual professional polish, but there was something softer in her expression today, a quiet pride that showed in the slight curve of her lips. Beside her, Mr. Michaels shifted his weight from foot to foot, his tie slightly askew despite obvious attempts to straighten it. The Arts Council members lined up nearby, their excitement barely contained. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the edges of the cloth covering the mural, making it dance slightly in the air conditioning's artificial breeze. The movement created shadows that teased at the vibrant colors hidden beneath, like a preview of what was to come. Zora and Zaya stood slightly apart from the crowd, their hands clasped together. Zaya squeezed her sister's fingers gently, offering silent support. Zora's face remained composed, but her eyes never left the covered mural, their creation, their statement, their truth waiting to be revealed. The hallway fell silent as Dr. Moore stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor in a steady rhythm. She turned to face the gathered crowd, her voice clear and strong as it carried through the space. "Art," she began, "is often born from silence." Her words hung in the air for a moment before she continued. "But the best art refuses to stay quiet." The simple truth of her statement resonated through the corridor. Several students nodded, understanding the layers of meaning behind her words. Dr. Moore stepped back, giving space for what would come next. Zaya moved forward then, her natural warmth drawing all eyes to her. She spoke briefly but powerfully about their journey, about the importance of visibility and voice, about the power of creating something that couldn't be ignored or misunderstood. Her words flowed easily, touching on the difficult moments without dwelling on them, focusing instead on the strength found in continuing to create. When she finished, all eyes turned to Zora, expecting her to speak as well. But Zora remained silent. Instead, she moved purposefully toward the covered mural, her steps steady and determined. Without ceremony or hesitation, she reached up and pulled down the cloth. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave, followed by a collective intake of breath. The mural, finally revealed in its entirety, commanded attention with its sheer scale and vibrancy. Maya Angelou's figure dominated one section, her words seeming to float off the wall and into the air itself, weaving through clouds and stars in a dance of poetry and power. Basquiat's iconic crown framed a complex collage of city life, streets and faces and moments captured in bold strokes and vivid colors. At the center, impossible to miss, stood the two black girls on their ladder. Their figures reached upward, transforming heavy chains into threads of gleaming gold that sparkled even in the fluorescent lighting. The metaphor was clear but not heavy-handed, speaking volumes without saying a word. Beneath this central image, words had been carefully painted in a strong, clear hand. They tried to frame us, so we made our own canvas. The silence that had followed the unveiling broke into spontaneous applause. The sound filled the hallway, bouncing off walls and ceiling, growing louder as more people joined in. Several students wiped at their eyes, moved by the power of what they were seeing. Teachers stood speechless, some nodding slowly as they took in the layers of meaning woven throughout the piece. Zora stepped back to stand beside her sister, her face still serious but her posture different now. She stood tall, shoulders back, head high, not seeking approval but claiming space. The mural spoke for her, saying everything she needed to say. Off to the side, partially hidden by the crowd, Ms. Hemmings watched the scene unfold. Her face remained carefully neutral, giving away nothing of her thoughts as she studied the artwork she had once mistaken for vandalism. Her eyes moved from detail to detail, taking in the technical skill, the symbolic weight, the undeniable impact of the piece. Dr. Moore noticed her presence and their eyes met briefly across the crowd. The superintendent's gaze was steady, neither accusatory nor forgiving, before she deliberately turned away. Her attention returned to the twins and their artwork, to this moment that belonged not to past mistakes or future consequences, but to these two young artists who had transformed an act of prejudice into a statement of power. The crowd continued to respond to the mural, their reactions honest and unfiltered, without the presence of media cameras. Some students approached the wall slowly, pointing out details to each other in hushed voices. Others stood back, taking in the full impact of the piece from a distance. The artwork seemed to grow more powerful with each passing moment, its message clear and undeniable in the morning light. The Saturday evening after the mural unveiling, warmth and light spilled from the windows of Dr. Moore's craftsman-style home. Inside, the dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter as plates clinked and savory aromas filled the air. Dr. Moore had prepared her signature jerk chicken, rice, and peas, and roasted vegetables, comfort food for a celebration that felt more like family gathering than formal dinner. Mr. Wallace sat at one end of the table, gesturing animatedly as he described the students' reactions to the mural. "I've never seen anything like it," he said, reaching for another piece of cornbread. Kids who usually rush past without looking at anything were stopping, really taking it in. Beside him, Ms. Rodriguez, the school's ESL coordinator and a longtime advocate for minority students, nodded enthusiastically. "One of my students who barely speaks in class wrote a whole page about what the mural meant to her," she shared, her eyes bright with emotion. Zaya leaned forward in her chair, soaking in every word, occasionally adding her own observations about their classmates' responses. Her natural warmth and energy seemed to light up her corner of the table. But Zora sat quietly, pushing food around her plate more than eating it. She watched the adults talk, her dark eyes taking everything in while revealing little. When someone directed a question her way, she answered politely but briefly, letting the conversation flow around her like a stream around a stone. Dr. Moore noticed her daughter's reserve but didn't push. She understood that healing had its own timeline, that some wounds needed space more than words. Instead, she kept the conversation flowing, making sure everyone's plate stayed full and their glasses never empty. The evening progressed into a cozy scene of coffee and dessert in the living room. The guests settled into comfortable chairs and the plush sectional sofa, the formal dinner atmosphere dissolving into something more intimate. Family photos lined the walls, including several of Zora and Zaya's art pieces from over the years. Dr. Moore stood then, coffee cup in hand, and the room naturally quieted. Her presence had that effect, not demanding attention but drawing it naturally. She smiled, looking around at the gathered faces. "I wanted you all here tonight not just to celebrate the mural," she began, her voice warm but carrying the weight of purpose, "but to share something important." She set her cup down and pulled a folder from her briefcase. "The district is launching a new initiative, the Racial Equity Audit Program. It will be student-led, examining everything from curriculum to disciplinary practices to resource allocation." The room hummed with interest. Mr. Wallace sat up straighter, already seeing the possibilities. "And," Dr. Moore continued, turning to face her daughters, "I want both of you on the founding board." The offer landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of reaction through the room. Zaya's eyes widened, her whole body seeming to lean forward with excitement. But Zora went completely still, her face a careful mask. "Yes," Zaya exclaimed immediately, already thinking out loud about potential projects and approaches. "We could start with anonymous surveys, maybe create a safe reporting system." But Zora remained quiet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When everyone looked her way expectantly, she spoke softly but clearly. "I need time to think about it." The adults exchanged glances, but Dr. Moore smoothly moved the conversation forward, outlining more details about the program. The discussion flowed naturally into broader topics of school reform and student advocacy, carrying through the rest of the evening. As the guests began to leave, each offering warm hugs and words of encouragement, the house gradually emptied until only the family remained. Zaya headed upstairs to call friends, leaving Zora alone in the living room. Dr. Moore found her daughter sitting on the window seat, looking out at the darkened yard. Without saying anything, she sat down beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd. The silence between them felt comfortable, well worn like a favorite sweater. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to lead the fight," she said, watching her daughter's profile. "But your voice deserves the microphone." Zora didn't respond immediately, but her shoulders relaxed slightly at her mother's words. Across town, in a very different setting, Ms. Hemmings walked into the Equity Rehabilitation Center for her first assigned project. The community center's art room was basic but well lit, filled with the kind of energy that came from young people gathering with purpose. 6 formerly incarcerated youth sat at tables, some looking skeptical, others curious. Paint supplies and a blank wall waited. Ms. Hemmings, for once, didn't move to take charge. Instead, she pulled up a chair and sat down, her usual authoritative demeanor noticeably absent. "I'm here to listen," she said simply and meant it. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the school's windows, casting long rectangles of light across the hallway floor. Zora stood alone before the mural, her art supplies spread out beside her. The corridor was empty, peaceful in the way schools only feel on weekends. She studied the artwork, their artwork, taking in all its complex layers and meanings. Then, with careful precision, she began to add one final detail, a delicate golden thread. It curled upward from the top of the ladder, weaving its way toward the painted clouds before disappearing into their depths. Unfinished, still being woven, still reaching higher. Stepping back, Zora looked at this last addition, this small but significant detail. For the first time since that Friday night weeks ago, a genuine smile spread across her face. It wasn't a broad grin or a dramatic gesture, just a quiet upturn of lips, a softening around her eyes. The mural wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't even really an ending at all. The pain of that night still lingered, the work of change still stretched ahead, and not everything was healed. But something had begun, something real and powerful and true, and for now that was enough. The late August sun streamed through the school windows, casting long shadows across freshly waxed floors. Students bustled through the hallways with first-day energy, their voices echoing off lockers and walls. Zora and Zaya Carter walked side by side, now juniors, their backpacks slung over their shoulders as they navigated the familiar corridors. Down the main hallway, Principal Michaels led a group of new teachers on their orientation tour. Their shoes clicked against the floor as they moved from space to space, learning about emergency exits and supply closets. The group looked fresh-faced and eager, clutching notebooks and taking careful notes. And now, Principal Michaels announced, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed the year before, we come to our most important stop. He gestured toward the mural that dominated the front hallway wall. The new teachers gathered before it, their conversations falling silent as they took in the sweeping imagery. Maya Angelou's watchful gaze, Basquiat's crown, the two black girls on their ladder weaving chains into threads of gold. This is more than artwork, Principal Michaels explained, his tone measured and deliberate. It's a reminder. Every new staff member must spend time here before teaching their first class. Reflect on what you see. Consider what it means for our school community. From around the corner, Zora watched the scene unfold. She stood partially hidden behind a row of lockers, observing as each teacher approached the mural. Some nodded thoughtfully. Others took pictures with their phones, but one young white teacher caught her attention. The woman stepped forward slowly, her hand rising to cover her mouth as she took in the details. Tears welled in her eyes as she studied the figures, the symbols, the golden thread disappearing into painted clouds. She didn't try to hide her emotion or explain it away. She simply stood there, letting the mural's message wash over her. Zaya appeared beside her sister, followed closely by Cleo. The three of them watched the scene together, a quiet understanding passing between them. Cleo reached into her messenger bag and pulled out a stack of bright yellow flyers, handing them to the twins. Hot off the printer, she said softly. Student Equity Board meeting at 3:30. The flyers were simple but bold, featuring the board's new logo, a bridge made of interlocking hands. Below it, the text read, "Your voice matters. Join us." Zaya took her copy, already mentally preparing her talking points for the meeting. She glanced at her sister, who held the flyer like it might bite. "You ready?" Zora stared at the paper for a long moment. Her fingers traced the edges as she considered the question. "Not really," she admitted quietly. Then, straightening her shoulders slightly, she added, "But I'll go anyway." Across the city, in a modern office building downtown, Ms. Hemming sat across from Dr. Moore, a thick folder open on the desk between them. The former art teacher looked different. Her usual polished exterior remained, but something in her eyes had changed. There was a humility there that hadn't existed before. She walked Dr. Moore through her report methodically, detailing her work with inner-city youth at the rehabilitation center. Photos showed murals in progress, young artists learning techniques, community spaces transformed by color and meaning. Her voice carried none of her old defensive pride, just quiet conviction as she presented the results. "They taught me more than I taught them," she explained, showing before and after images of a community center wall, about perspective, about what art means beyond technique. Dr. Moore listened carefully, her expression neutral but attentive. When Ms. Hemmings finished her presentation, she closed the folder deliberately. "I'm not here to ask for redemption," Ms. Hemmings said clearly. "I'm here to request more hours at the center. There's work to be done, and I'd like to continue doing it." Back at the school, Zora stood before a classroom of 7th graders, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their slight trembling. The younger students looked up at her with varying degrees of interest as she explained the mural's history. Some seemed captivated, others fidgeted in their seats, but all fell silent when she described the night of the incident. She spoke without drama or self-pity, laying out the facts as they had happened. The permission note, the police, the handcuffs, the way it felt to be invisible in your own school. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, finding its rhythm in the telling. When she finished, several hands shot into the air. She called on a small girl in the front row, her hair in neat braids tied with yellow ribbons. "Why did you paint chains?" the girl asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Zora looked at her, really looked at her, seeing perhaps a reflection of herself at that age. When she answered, her voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "Because some stories try to hold us down, but we don't just break the chains, we turn them into bridges." The mural stretched above them in the hallway beyond, its colors caught in the late morning sunlight. The golden thread continued its journey upward, disappearing into painted clouds. Not an ending, but a continuation. A story still being written. If you enjoyed the story of Zaya and Zora, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.